Today we're going to dive into the topic of healing through healthy boundaries and building strong relationships with our guest, licensed counselor Asia Robinson. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for coming on to No Strings Attached. So tell the people something about yourself that nobody would guess.
Ooh, ooh, you put me on the spot. That's a hard question. hmm. Okay, I guess I could talk about why I became a therapist. The biggest reason is because I found myself in some hard positions in my life where I felt like I didn't have anyone to talk to that looked like me, and so that was a big reason as to why I became a therapist. Being a therapist is not a career for me; it's a calling for me. And I
Mhm.
mean that wholeheartedly. It's something that when I wake up and I do it, I don't feel like it's a job for me.
Okay. What are healthy boundaries and why are they essential to building stronger relationships?
Well, let's start off with boundaries in general. So there are three different types of boundaries. There are rigid boundaries, there are porous boundaries, and there are healthy boundaries. So rigid boundaries are boundaries that are very restrictive, not much wiggle room, no flexibility, that type of thing. Porous boundaries are boundaries that are kind of when you think about a colander or a strainer, you're saying you're setting a boundary, but then all the water, like a strainer, goes through, and there it doesn't hold much, right? A lot can go through that. And so a healthy boundary is kind of the middle between the two. It's not being so far on this side, which is very rigid, but it's also not being so far on this side where it's very porous and open and loose. So having a healthy boundary is meeting in the middle.
Mm,
So a healthy boundary looks different for everybody. A healthy boundary for me may look very different for you. And a
right.
boundary really it helps to bring people together, not tear them apart. And unfortunately, boundaries have that negative attachment to them or labeling of them of, if you're setting a boundary that means don't cross me, when really it's saying this is where I would like you to meet me.
Hmm. I mean, you gave an example of each one. Um, I would say of a personal relationship boundary. Would you give us an example of that?
Absolutely. So, it could be something as small as being on time. So, maybe you have a friend or a partner and you're meeting them for lunch or something like that, and they're constantly late. The boundary there would be your time. Your time is it's important, it's valuable. And so setting that boundary would be saying, "Hey, friend, partner, person, whoever, I need you to be on time because I value my time. And when you don't value my time, it makes me feel like you don't value me." But boundaries go far and wide. It could be a time boundary, it could be a personal space boundary, it could be an emotional boundary,
Mhm.
of how someone talks to you or doesn't talk to you, shuts you down when you're talking about your emotions or, not being able to receive feedback. All those things, there's so many different types of boundaries.
How can someone, including myself, how can we recognize when they have boundary issues in personal relationships?
That's really up to the individual themselves of what feels like, okay, I'm needing something in this situation. So I would say personal reflection, if anything, starting there. When we have encounters with people, sometimes we're not sure, and let's say it's a negative one, and these are people that are close to you. You have a situation that happens and you're not sure what happened or why you feel the way you do. I think first of all, taking a step back to reflect on what happened, taking the time to process that, and then thinking about your own values. What do you value, and where was the line crossed for you of where you felt like your values weren't considered. So it kind of goes back to the example of the time. I value my time, and so if someone is constantly not being on time or they are, not showing up for something, that is an example of your boundary being crossed and a value of mine that you would have to tell someone, hey, this is my value. This is something that I need in order for us to stay where we are.
So recognizing when boundaries are crossed,
Absolutely.
basically.
Absolutely.
So is there any indication or red flag somebody can kind of look for when somebody is crossing the boundary?
Well, how it makes you feel. That's the first thing, you know. And also boundaries are so individualized to the person because it also extends to your experience in life and things that you've been through and why you are the way you are. You
Mm.
know, if you've been through certain situations to where maybe you feel like, okay, trust and loyalty is something that you didn't have in previous relationships, and that's something that now in this new relationship you're noticing that that boundary is being crossed, then that is something that is worth bringing up. And you know you value that because you've been in a space where you didn't have that or where that boundary was again crossed. And so it's really thinking about your own personal values of how you see the world and what you need, but then also in combination to your experience in this world.
How do you create good communication?
Right.
I'm listening for this one.
That's a great question because that one is probably the second hardest thing with creating a boundary is learning how to communicate the boundary. So, you know, once you go through that process of sitting with yourself and figuring out what your values are to even set a boundary and reflecting on your own personal experiences, then you are ready to communicate your boundaries. And the way to do that is to be cognizant of a few things: your tone, your body language, you know, your mood, things like that, things that would contribute to miscommunication. And then the other biggest thing with communicating your boundaries is understanding that just because you communicate your boundaries to someone doesn't mean that person is one going to automatically understand or be ready to change. And then the
Mhm.
second thing is understanding that creating the boundary doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to evoke change from someone else. So the boundary is, if you want to be in my life, this is how I expect to be treated. This is where I would like for you to meet me. But it also comes with the notion that that person or people may not live up to that expectation, and you may have to make some choices, or there may have to be some consequences to breaking the boundary.
That's true. I think for me, I feel selfish. I mean, how do we get over not feeling like it's a selfish thing to tell a person where they are or how they made you feel when you're setting boundaries?
Absolutely, yeah. You know, it's easy to think to yourself, okay, me requiring this might be me asking for too much. But usually that feeling, that thought comes from people pleasing, you know, over and over again, time and time again, and feeling as though, you know, you don't owe it to yourself to have these boundaries that work for you. And you know yourself, so you know what boundaries you need. And so the biggest thing I can say about that is standing firm in the boundary and reassuring yourself and reaffirming yourself that the boundary you've created is what you need for you. Because if you don't believe it, you don't stand on it, then no one else will. So it takes confidence to believe, okay, this is the boundary, this is what I need. And if I don't get that, then this may not be the relationship situation for me, if that makes sense. And then also
Hmm.
allowing flexibility. So, you know, yes, you can create a boundary, and yes, you have this expectation that someone needs to follow that boundary, whatever it may be, like we talked about, emotional, time, physical, whatever. But also, there are certain situations where we need to be flexible as people. And so, you know, the guilt sometimes comes from, well, if I set this boundary, then this person is going to be upset with me. Maybe, but also there should be room for flexibility. It kind of goes back to the rigid and porous boundaries that we were talking about at the beginning. If it's too
Hmm.
rigid, then that can be hard because that means we're not leaving space for people to be people and for us to be people and to change depending on the circumstance. But if it's too porous, again, then that means that it's not firm, it's gonna fall through, and it's not nothing that you're upkeeping. And so full circle, reassuring yourself, the self talk
Mm.
with yourself, you know, reminding yourself that you are deserving and worthy of this boundary and you know why you need this boundary. Because again, boundaries also stem from personal experience. And so the things that you've been through would allow you to have created this personal boundary that you're setting with this person. And keep it in mind of, why am I setting this boundary? I'm setting this boundary because I would like us to meet each other. I would like for us to, you know, preserve this relationship. I don't want to let go of this relationship. I don't want to take space from you, you know, that kind of thing. I don't
Yeah.
want it to be toxic, negative, all these other different things.
I guess I will say, just speaking from experience, fear of setting boundaries because sometimes I feel like you lose people when you set boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And the fear and then the guilt that you have because you feel like, well, why did I set that boundaries? And but is it worth setting the boundaries and losing the person or losing yourself? What I got out of it, right? Is which one is worth it? Is it me losing myself, losing the person to set the boundaries? And unfortunately, where I am in life, you gotta go.
Well, and hopefully, you know, with setting a boundary, that's not the first thing that has to happen. Is you have to go. The goal is okay, this is going to take some time. This is going to take work on both of our ends. But it also, you brought up a good point. It really is between you and that other person of if they're ready, if they're willing to work on it. Because if they're not willing to work on it, then sometimes the exit is the answer. Separation is the answer.
I think one question that I personally have with setting boundaries is personal boundaries. How do you maintain your personal boundaries, not for the people, but for you?
Mm.
Saying this is the boundary. So, is there anything that you can give me or the people on maintaining personal boundaries for self?
Yeah, absolutely. So, discipline, right? Discipline and motivation are two different things. Motivation is fleeting. Sometimes we have it, sometimes we don't. Discipline is you get up and do it every single day. And so, with personal boundaries, is having that discipline that you know what you need and you know what you owe yourself and believing in that and practicing that, because that's also where the self-love comes from, is discipline, showing yourself time and time again that you deserve a certain type of treatment. And so if you are working on boundaries with other people, the boundaries with yourself also need to be
Say that.
there.
Say that. I be saying that all the time. And speaking of self care, what does self care and maintaining the boundaries, like how do they like coexist together? Like what really makes that coexist and make it great? What in your opinion?
So, the reason that the boundary was created, I'm assuming, usually is because of something that was lacking before. And so the self care is what helps to remind yourself of what you need for you. So it's giving back to you. Boundaries are for you, and they're for the other person as well. But that is part of self care. That's part of, doing the best for yourself. It's actually up there with what? Eating healthy, getting, a good night's rest, exercise, up there with it, because your mental health is just as important. And so self-care is not just, getting your nails done, getting your hair done. Self-care also is the way you treat yourself. And so having boundaries is part of that, and it's part of your mental health and how you go about your day to day. So I
That's
hope
so
that kind
true.
of answers.
It did for me. Just being personal, I've been on my boundary journey lately. And so I think this was big for me to start off with boundaries because it's taken me a long time to create personal boundaries and also just boundaries where for my existence and around me, my bubble. So there are boundaries. There is a way that you can treat me. There is a way that you should not treat me. There is a way that I will move when you treat me that way. And so I guess the leading question for that one would be when people give you, how do you handle pushback? How do you handle people who give you, like, you're creating these boundaries and they like, that ain't, well, no, I ain't in it. Well, you should have said that a long time ago. Or if that was your problem, like, what do you say to those people who are having, especially with loved ones, because I think loved ones are the main ones who feel like there shouldn't be no boundaries for me because
Exactly.
I am who I am. I grew up with you. I have 7 brothers. So listen, there wasn't a whole lot of boundaries in the household. And then as I got older, I learned what boundaries were. But how do you give somebody something who can help with pushback? Like, give us something that help us with some pushback because I get a lot of pushback.
You know what? That is something that I hear often too is, the pushback that people get from family and friends and things like that because they're used to a certain dynamic with that person, and so for them it's like, well, who are you trying to be? Who are you becoming? Because before yesterday this worked. Now today you telling me this doesn't work, and so and that's okay. That's part of boundaries too, is understand that your boundaries are for you. And so what worked for you yesterday may not work for you today. And that is okay.
Flesh dies daily.
Right. And so that's the first thing. That's the first thing. The second thing is communication, assertive communication. So I want to emphasize that because, passive communication is very much so, well, it's okay. You don't have to. It's the porous boundaries that we talked about earlier.
Mhm.
Aggressive communication is, well, I'm angry. You should listen to me. This is my boundary. I said what I said, that kind of thing. And we have to understand that when we are creating boundaries, again, it's to meet people where we are, and to come together. And so we don't want to push them away with our communication if it's aggressive, but we also don't want to be too passive. So being assertive and being firm with what you're saying, and also being patient with explaining to the person, this is why I need this boundary. This is why I need this for me. Now, with that being said, not taking it too far to feel like you need to continue to explain yourself. That's not necessary, you know. But it is a good thing to communicate why you're setting this boundary, where that comes from, so people can understand you better. And obviously, it just depends on the person if they're willing to listen or not. But then it comes back to you, because if you feel like, you've stated the boundary and they're not listening to you, they don't want to take it in, they don't want to receive what it is that you're saying, then you have to take a step back and reevaluate the relationship, reevaluate how do we connect now, and also sometimes space is needed, because if you're saying, okay, this is what I need now, sometimes people need time to adjust to that. And so we can't be so quick to expect, okay, I told you just yesterday I need you to do X, Y, and Z. This is going to take some time. So that's where the
Yeah,
flexibility comes in, is we have to be flexible and understanding that because we're setting a boundary doesn't mean that people are going to jump on the bandwagon immediately. We have to give them time to understand the boundary, get adjusted to the boundary, and at least try. Now, again, if that does not happen, then the exit is that way. Like it,
exit left, exit right, exit front, exit back, whichever one.
that's what needs to happen depending on the situation. But do I think that that's the first thing, is to just quick run, cut it? No. But sometimes
Right.
it does come to that. Worst case, it comes to that. So.
So making relationships healthy and stronger is mainly boundaries and communication. So I will ask, from a personal experience, what example can you give us from a personal experience
Mm-hmm.
that set the tone for healthy boundaries and a stronger relationship?
Oh, you put me on the spot. So, I had a friend that, anytime we would agree to meet or to, do anything like that, to go to lunch or dinner, go see a movie, whatever, it was always expected of me to pick her up, drop her off, and sometimes even pay for the meal. And so, right, right. So it's a lot of backstory to that. I've known this person for a very long time. We're no longer friends anymore. Um, the boundary.
Look like we got some similarities. Go ahead.
And so basically with that situation, we talked about, how I was feeling, and feeling like it wasn't my energy wasn't being reciprocated in this relationship. And that was not met well, because this person was used to me being such a giver and felt like I should continue to give with no, no boundaries, no type of restraint, anything like that. And it just didn't work. It didn't work. We had a lot of conversations. I tried to talk to her about it, and it just was something that kind of went downhill. But the biggest thing in that was understanding that, and that's when I really learned too, that even with setting a boundary, that doesn't necessarily mean that people are willing to work on it or to change their behavior if necessary to preserve the relationship. And I had to be okay with that. And so, it's something that, yes, boundaries are hard, but it's one of those things where you have to decide it's either that person, or it's your own self worth and value, and how you feel about yourself. And for me, it just wasn't worth keeping this person around who I didn't feel like was adding to my life, that I felt in turn was taking in a way, and, not reciprocating the effort I was putting in, and also not respecting my boundaries. And so for me, I had to let that relationship go, unfortunately. But it taught me something, that taught me true self love in those moments. Hindsight, now of course in the moment it didn't feel like that. It felt like I was, being an awful friend. It felt like she was being an awful friend to me, all these other different
Yeah.
emotions. But hindsight, when I look back on the situation, I'm proud of myself, because I tried to communicate. I did what I could do, but at the same time, I was firm in my boundary of, I just won't accept that type of behavior, and I deserve a lot more than that. And so, to kind of go back to what we were saying about boundaries and self care, it also is rooted in self love. Essentially, you setting this boundary is saying, I love me,
Mhm.
and I love you too, and I want it to be good. And so,
Facts.
when you were asking about the guilt earlier, sometimes people have to realize that, yes, the feelings of guilt and confusion, and you have a range of different emotions. You choose, you have a lot of different ones happening, all at once at points. And with boundaries, it does evoke a lot of emotions, but you have to remember, at the end of the day, there's a reason that you wanted to set this boundary to begin with, and usually it's rooted in self-love.
Yeah. Self, I mean, over the year, and so self love and self care has really been big. So that does help you create boundaries. Personally, for myself, I'll give a scenario. I think because I've always been a giver and everybody has always had an expectation of me, of giving and coming through. And sometimes what I love about what happened with me was it wasn't me who set the boundary. It was God for me. And there was nothing that I can do about it. And for me, and it made the other person upset because it was like, well, you didn't come through for me. You said this, you said that. And I did. My intentions were pure, my intentions were good, but God said, I told you to sit down and there was something that you had to get done. And so the boundary, I think for me, was that you have to know I'm in transition and I'm first.
Right.
I'm first. That's the way I see it for me. That's where I got out of it. It was I'm first. And that was loving me first. But even in the moment, I didn't even think it was about me because I was upset at the fact that I had to do anything. Okay. Even though I didn't do for the person, I wasn't even trying to do for me. But at the end of the day, it wasn't for me, it was for God. It was a situation that I needed to do. And he was like, well, if you're not going to do for me, then guess what? Then it don't look like you're going to help nobody else. So for me, that was a personal thing for me and boundaries. And just what I got out of was it's communication too. So although we said boundaries, I think communication is very important. And over the, I mean, I have had some the way people teach you when you grow up, I guess when you're taught communication in my household or in my family was not taught properly. And so when you run into somebody else, sometimes your communication and their communication clash because you don't do it the way that they see fit.
Right.
But if they know that you are a person who understands that your communication hasn't always been great, again, it's you gonna keep riding with me as we get these boundaries in order, or are you gonna exit left or you gonna exit right? And for me, it's like, hey, I know that this is an issue. This is something I'm creating a boundary for myself to say I want to do better communication. But if you can't see that, well, don't let the door hit you where the good Lord split you, is, what the people say. So for me, I am creating boundaries and self-care, and I wasn't I'm not a boundary person. I think God has created all of the boundaries. Taking people away that has been there too long because clearly I couldn't create it. I couldn't get rid of them. I have a big heart. At the end of the day, I have a really big heart. So
Yeah. And you know
I
what? That's
go
a
ahead.
really, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but I want to emphasize that having a big heart is a real big reason as to why boundaries are necessary. Because when you have a giving nature and that's how you are as a person, it's easy for you to be looked over and for things to just kind of just happen, and then you just sit there like, okay, well, what just happened? What just happened? And this is not the energy that I've given you, so why am I getting this energy?
Yeah,
And so, having a big heart and having that type of nature definitely needs to come with boundaries to, preserve and protect yourself. So
true.
it's necessary.
Super necessary. Super necessary. I know. I think when I first started therapy, one of the questions was why you're here, right? And it was, I gotta learn to create some boundaries. I gotta be able to like communicate. The communication and boundaries have always been since I've started. Therapy was one of the main focus for me because I knew that's what I lack, right? I lack those things. And when people have an expectation of you, that's what I've learned is that, they sit on that. And then when you change those expectations, it kind of lets you know where they stand. Because if they ride with you, they ride with you. And if they don't. And for me, it's not, it doesn't feel good because I love you so much. And it's like, well, if I loved you even when I was bad with communication, if I loved you even when I didn't have boundaries, why now that I have these things, you can't love me the same?
Right.
Like you can't love me too, in that. So I guess my question would be, how do we allow ourselves to be okay with letting go?
That's a hard one. So letting go is not easy because you're essentially having to, and we mean letting go of the relationship, right?
Right, because healthy relationships, right? So letting go of the relationship.
So letting go of any relationship really, that we feel like at some point we really value, it is hard. It's not easy. And we have to grieve it, just as if we lost something or lost someone, even with that person still being here, we have to grieve it. And so that takes time. But also, reflection is necessary. Journaling is necessary. Really kind of just sitting with yourself and figuring out what even happened. What
Hmm.
happened? Who am I? How was I showing up? Again, what is it that I need? Thinking about that, thinking about my experience as a person and, why I required this to begin with, things like that are necessary to let go of people. And another thing is keep it in mind that, everyone that we come into contact with, everyone that we, have an experience with teaches us something. And so,
Hmm.
there's a reason and there's a season. And so it's understanding that
Amen.
maybe that was the time is up now. Maybe I gained what I could get from this relationship and I need to go my own way and they need to go their own way. I think sometimes we get caught up in this idea that when we meet people, whether that be friendships or romantic relationships, we're supposed to just stay on this journey with them forever. And that's just not always the case. And so, really just being okay with whatever value they added to our life at that time and being okay with them going and releasing them so that they can continue on their journey in whatever way that means. And the same for us. So it's I would say reframing it because it is a loss. We do have to grieve it, but also we took something from it and we gained something from it and we gave something to that person too. Like we are here impacting each other, and so it's not just about all that I gave to this person. It's also about what they gave to me. And just in general the experience that I got from them, and the lessons that I learned. And so it's I would say letting go is hard, but it's also thinking bigger picture. What did I gain from this? And also did this person is it time for this person to leave my life? Is the season and the journey over with this person? And do I need to re-navigate to go in a different direction? Because usually that means that we've probably outgrown each other. Maybe my values are not your values. Maybe the lens that I see the world through is not the lens you see the world through, and that's okay. And not everybody sees the lens through this, sees the world through the same lens. But it's just this idea that if the vision is so very different, then
Hmm.
there may not be anything we have in common anymore. And so I have to step back and release you. And same.
I think that is okay. I mean, I had to learn. It's not easy. I'm not a person who is a fan of letting go, but I think it is healthy because I realized that over the course of the years, I mean, I think I dropped a lot of weight because I let a lot of people go.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way that I look at my life. The more I let people go who are no longer um, a value or tribute to my life, that it just makes it easier for me. I remember a pastor saying, well, one of the past, I call her Dr. B. And she said to me one time, she said, people cannot make you feel bad about you when you know about you. And I knew that boundaries and communications was something that I needed because anytime somebody would point it out to me, I get like an attitude, like, nah, like, no, I'm good, like, nah, that ain't it. But I realized that if you can get upset about it, you can get mad about it, that something has to be wrong. And so, to this day, so even though I'm not around her all the time, like you said, people teach you things along the way. And that was something that stuck with me. So when I came, I was like, nah, something wrong. Something wrong. And I have to fix it. And also, some people that I didn't want to lose. And communication will make you lose people that you don't really, that is not necessary. But if you just learn how to do certain things, create the boundaries, create the healthy communication and relationship, that you can keep them. And so, I had to make sure I got you on here so that you can help us. And you helped us. You helped me, all the time. All the time.
Thank you.
All the time. Thank you. Thank you for coming on No Strings Attached podcast. You can tell the people where they can get to you or reach you or find you or what you're trying to do in life and, all those wonderful things.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me say this. Yes, I'm a licensed therapist, but this in no means necessarily was, any advice directly to anyone that needs to be in therapy. If you need to be in therapy, then you need to find you a therapist. Um, But this was more psycho ed and teaching, so I hope that that is received. So, in terms of booking or anything like that, setting up sessions, you can definitely just Google me and you'll find me online. You'll go through that process. It's not that hard. So, you Google me. But then my social media, so for Instagram, I am on Instagram, nothing else, is X underscore underscore, so 5 underscores Asia with the extra A at the end. So, it's long, I know, but that's my Instagram.
So one more time for the people like me who did not catch it the first time.
X underscore 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 5 underscores Asia with the extra A. Yeah.
With the extra A. Asia with an extra A. Well, I appreciate you again. Thank you for coming on No Strings Attached podcast with me. I appreciate you. I looking forward because we're gonna have another time with Asia again soon, soon. Hopefully, we won't have to talk about healing. We'll talk about other things.
Yes, absolutely.
Maybe we'll be a little healed in some things already.
Yes, yes. Or we talk about how the boundaries are going.
Yeah, there we go. There we go. How we're growing in the boundaries. Or we go back to when people cross them. We might just need that.
Absolutely. That too. That too. That too. And how to just keep maintaining the boundary. Yes.
There we go. Again, I appreciate you so much. Thank you.
You.